I want to tell you a story. If I stand back, I can see that it's almost unbelievable. But the truth is, I can't stand back for very long, because it's a story about how and why my mother was murdered.
A journalist who investigated corruption among politicians, officials and business people in Malta has been killed by a car bomb. Daphne Caruana Galizia died on Monday
Her
afternoon.
continued existence on this planet made someone scared.
Anger in Malta as protesters demand the Prime Minister's resignation, accusing him of protecting the killers of an outspoken journalist.
You know, I did get a briefing from some very high-ranking person in Europe who said, keep going with what you're doing because our indications are this whole thing goes up to the top.
Malta's political crisis is deepening. Demonstrators surrounded Parliament, trapping government ministers from the ruling Labour Party inside for several hours.
It's the first sense of real hope I've felt in 2 years. But there's a part of me that's angrier than I have ever been.
I run music festivals and I'm the founder and festival director of Love Supreme Festival in Sussex.
I'm one of the co-founders and editor here at Tortoise.
I'm one of the co-founders of Tortoise.
I'm an editor and partner at Tortoise Media.
It's actually the creative collaboration of a team of people who put on great music festivals and a team of people that you know because you backed us on Kickstarter before, building a new type of newsroom.
I think there's really a thirst for knowledge and discourse, but there's also a thirst for feeling and experience. And bringing together an ideas festival with a music festival, I think, can help satisfy that desire.
It is going to be a completely different festival. Ours is really built around the idea that something is fundamentally changing in the way in which we all live. We're much more activist, we're much more passionate. And so what we want to do is give people a chance to really engage with the people, the politicians, the business leaders, the cultural icons who are shaping the way we live, to engage with them in conversation, not just sit and listen, but really engage with them. And in the way in which you do at a festival for music, you're part of the show, we want that to be the case when it comes to ideas.
Challenges ahead of us like AI, climate change, population growth, belonging in what it means to be part of a community.
Beautiful surroundings, great food, great artists, bars, the ability to camp or glamp.
Definitely glamping.
A mixture of, if you like, fireside chats and a big top, and we'll have a ThinkIn village at Kite, which means that we'll have a series of tents and simultaneous think-ins going on.
It's a celebration of great ideas, and then it goes on to a really great party at night with some amazing music.
It's really the love child of Hay and Latitude.
TED Talks meets So Far Sounds. The most important thing about who's involved in the festival is you, the Kickstarter community. As we shape the ideas for the festival, as we shape the music for the festival, your input will be more important than James's. So as a founder of the festival, you will always get the best price tickets, you will always hear about the festival first, but even when we're sold out, if you've been a founder, you'll always be able to get tickets.
Help us to make sure that Kite flies.
on the tube.
How very public-spirited of them.
Okay.
Could have stretched to an Uber, I think.
We need to, yeah.
Or even a minivan.
Just checking everyone is here. Wait. There's a couple more. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Tortoise. Welcome. My name's Meripy. Welcome to our newsroom if you haven't been here before, and welcome to a ThinkIn. Could I just have a quick show of hands about who has been to a ThinkIn here before? That's a really good number. And yet, for the people who haven't, I still need to do the blurbs. So I'm sorry to those of you who've heard this a million times before. But a ThinkIn is not a panel event. It's a system of organised listening, loosely based on a newspaper, news or a news organisation conference where you take an interesting idea of the moment and debate it within a group of people with the help of some experts who know all about it. And for that reason, they work best when you hear from as many people in the room as possible. So that includes you, as well as these guys. We do have one rule for the people who've been here loads of time before. What's the rule? No questions. See, it's becoming all interactive now. No questions, and that's because when people ask a question, they actually usually have something to say, and we really want to hear what you have to say and not hide behind a question if possible. But we do want to hear from you. Couple of things I need to tell you for the members who'd like to be part of this but couldn't be here. You are being filmed, and that gets streamed through our app, or it could be watched later on these little cameras and these little mics. So just be aware if you see that moving around, that's why. This is our tortoise timer called Agatha, named after our co-founder James Harding's pet tortoise, although recently learnt to be, am I allowed to say, sadly deceased. I don't know. I've put a real dampener on the mood. But there's a new... This is Agatha, still Agatha, making her way across the room for an hour from left to right. So please do keep an eye on the timer. Stick your hand up if you have something to say. And obviously, we love you talking about us on social media and using your phone to do that. But please don't do it during when we're having a conversation, if that's possible. So now it's just up to me to introduce our wise guests who are with us this evening. We have Carl Honore. That is how I say your surname.
Honore is probably closer.
Honore.
I answer to
I'm going to trust you on that. He's a best-selling author of many books, including Bolder, which is subtitled Making the Most of Our Longer Lives, which explores the upsides of ageing and is a manifesto against ageism. And we've got Dan Hegarty, who's the founder and CEO of Habito, the online mortgage broker, and Sarah Newton, who is a former Conservative MP and Minister of State at the Department for Work and Pensions, who's also the Director of Age Concern and the founder and director of the International Longevity Centre. Carl, can I start with you? Because we've already had 2 conversations about this. This is part of a series, which you'll see from the notes that you were handed out. And I have to be honest, there's definite worried undertones to this series, that we're all living longer, that nobody's prepared for it, that we won't have enough money, that we will probably get dementia, and everyone we know might die around us as we live longer. But you are positively enthusiastic about our long lives and the potential, and would you just start by telling us why?
Sure. I mean, I think you've put your finger on something very central there, which is that we live in a culture in thrall to the cult of youth, where we've swallowed the idea that aging is somehow a chamber of horrors, that you hit a certain point, whether it's, 30, 35, 40, and everything's just a downward spiral from there. Just everything gets worse, right? And I had that view myself until I spent a couple of years researching and writing this book, and came out the other side with a different view. Part of that view is that there are upsides to aging, believe it or not. I mean, some things, of course, change in ways that nobody welcomes, but many things stay the same as you get older, and some even get better. So just a couple of examples. Happiness is a good, we often think of aging, we think of it as being depressing, right? Later life is depressing. Think of the words we use to describe older people. Cranky, crotchety, grumpy, right? Grumpy old man, grumpy old woman. but untrue, because human beings follow what's called a U-shaped happiness curve, which means we start high in childhood, we bottom out in middle age, and then we bounce back up again. The adults that report the highest levels of life satisfaction and happiness are the over 55s, right? One of the reasons I think for that is that, again, another benefit of aging is that as we get older, we start to feel more comfortable in our own skin, less, worried about what other people think of us, more at ease with our place in the world and our own limitations. We don't feel we have to tiptoe around other people's expectations. So there's a famous agony aunt in North America called Ann Landers, and she famously said once, at 20, we worry about what other people think of us. At 40, we stop worrying about what other people think of us. And at 60, we realize they were never thinking about us at all. Yeah? And I think what that gets at is that lightness or freedom that comes upon you in the second half of your life when you realize you don't have to navigate everybody else's opinions and expectations, and you can streamline, drop things, focus on what really lights you up. And there's a long list of other things that improve as well. I mean, we have stronger social bonds as we get older. We get better socially. Our social acumen improves. We may have fewer relationships, but those relationships make us happier and fulfill us more. Productivity tends to go up in jobs that rely on social acumen, which is most nowadays. Creativity can hold up and get richer. The brain starts working in new and interesting ways that don't happen until you get into the second half of your life. And at the same time, it seems to me there's a tectonic shift going on in our culture where the world is changing in ways that favor aging. It's now a better time to grow older than it's ever been in human history. So you have in your hands a booklet there with a recipe. We have levers now, that things we can all do in our own lives to make sure that we age better. And we're getting better at aging, right? It is happening. Just one story ripped from the headlines of this week. I don't know if you saw a guy called George Hood.
You can pause there because we're going to take that moment. I want you to,
sure.
Because after you told me this when we spoke.
Oh, you went and dug him up. Nice.
I've got him. Q-tape.
Right, look at that.
Wait, where is he? You explain who George Hood is.
I'll talk you in, and then you throw it up there. George Hood broke the world planking record this week. He planked for 8 hours, 15 minutes, and 15 seconds. And he's 62 years old, right?
He's 62!
In other words, aging is not what it used to be.
It's because his back went. He couldn't get up.
Yeah, he locked in, yeah.
Yeah, and then he did 75 press-ups.
Did he really? Yeah. Then he did 75 press-ups. No, come on, that's
rubbing it in. Yeah, so So we'll
continue.
No, it's a good way to sign off on George, I think.
It's a good way to sign off.
Just audio-visual to go with it.
So I wanted to talk about that, and there were other examples. I think you mentioned in your TED talk that Louise Bourgeois. That's how.
Yeah, her iconic giant spider she came up with in her 80s. I mean, there's just so many examples of people hitting home runs or hitting it for six in later life now in ways that we didn't have. David Attenborough, amazing documentaries, leading the fight against climate change in his 90s.
And there's a Maya Angelou quote which is you can't as you get older.
Yeah, you can't use up creativity. The more you use, the more you have.
Love that.
That really nails something that runs against the cultural grain. We're always being told that creativity belongs to the young. Again, example from the world of entrepreneurship. If you think of an entrepreneur, who comes to mind?
Zuckerberg,
right? Yeah, that's the kind of go-to paradigm of the successful entrepreneur. But actually, and there are Zuckerbergs out there, but they're the outliers, right? If you look at the figures, sure, you get Zuckerbergs, they get all the media noise, all the coverage, but if you drill down into the numbers of who is setting up successful businesses and launching startups that thrive and work, it's people in middle age or beyond, right? The peak age for setting up a company is your late 50s. Right? So again, it's this what I'm trying to do with the book, and what I think we're all trying to do in a lot of different ways from different angles, is just rewrite the story about aging to forge a new narrative that is not Pollyannish and says everything is great about growing older. It's much more nuanced. It's going to be richer. It's going to be more honest, but also because of that, more optimistic. So saying, sure, there are things that are going to suck. There are things that will at the same time stay the same, but there are actually some things that will get better. And I think if we can embrace aging with that kind of spirit, then we will do it a whole lot better, more and more.
Thank you, Carl. Sarah, so we're living longer, and that's a great thing. Carl's made me feel better about it. But you know, when we talk, there is at the heart of this a dispute, I think, about who is going to pay for it. And, you know, there's a confusion around that. And how has that come about?
Well, I think a lot of it is because, you know, I mean, it's fantastic to hear, Carl, and that really positive attitude. But the research will show when you talk about ageing, a lot of people, you know, just don't want to engage with it because they think about dying and the end of life. And we're really bad culturally about talking about that. And then there's a huge amount of confusion already about, well, who's going to look after me? In our country, we have the amazing NHS. A lot of people will think that the NHS is going to take care of them. But in fact, even from its creation, it was there as a health service, not as a social care service. So there is a big confusion about, even when people do engage with the issue, about what's my responsibility, what's the state's responsibility. And anyway, it's just so awful, I don't even want to think about it. And because people don't really know how long they're going to live, then I'm sure there's going to be a tendency amongst people to think, oh, well, yes, I know that 1 in 4 people will get ill or have a debilitating condition, but it might not be me. And anyway, I've got these really other pressing things to do. I want to buy a home, I want to have a family, I want to go travelling. So maybe I don't really need to think about that now. So I think we need to think about this from a very human way, about all the other things that are going on in their lives. And what I really hope that we get to in the next Parliament is a consensus to create some clarity around the responsibility between the citizen and the state around paying for care. I think we've made huge progress on pensions with the auto-enrolments. We now have, you know, record numbers of people, including young people, who are saving for their futures in their workplace pensions. And that's going to give a lot more certainty and income in retirement for that generation. But still, that's not going to be enough if people get really ill. And there's still that question around social care. And we need to get that clarity and that cross-party agreement, because these are big, long-term changes. And then I'm sure there's a lot of innovation, we can talk about this later, about how we could do that and how we could pay for that.
Well, I think we'll come back to that, but actually, it's funny that you said that thing about young people choosing to pay into their mortgages. And I went around some of the young people in the office, and most of them have got a pension, you know, even though in their early 20s, partly because they're auto-enrolled, which was the new government scheme. The person that surprised me, of course, was Liz. When I asked you if you had a pension, what did you say?
I said, I have the minimum pension that I have to have, because you can't not have one. But I feel like putting money into a pension is like putting it in the bin, because I'm never going to see that cash.
And why do you think you're never going to see that cash?
Because I'm not going to live beyond 60.
But all the research suggests you will.
All my research suggests otherwise.
They're going to be 60 really good years, though, right?
I mean, it's quite a serious point, though, because there's actually quite a lot of people who think, like Liz, who just think this is not going to happen to me. I think there's two things going on. You firstly think, I'm not going to reach that age, or I'm not going to reach that problem. Or you think, if I do, the state will look after me because I live in Britain and there's the NHS. And so there's those two things going on there. Ellie, you had something to say about this as well.
I mean, it's kind of what Sarah said, but, you know, my first priority is rent or, you know, maybe buying somewhere. I don't really have the kind of expendable cash to be saving for a pension, let alone, you know, I want to move out first. But I was having this conversation with my parents, and my mum didn't opt in for a pension for 30 years in a big corporate company, and massively regrets it now because she has no pension. So she says that I'm not allowed to opt out, basically. So it was kind of the first, I guess, my parents are thinking about that kind of thing. And I don't know, I think, as you said, you know, we're much more of a kind of experience generation where all of our money is spent on chasing the next thing. I said to Mary earlier, like, I don't even know if I want to stay living in the UK forever. Maybe I don't even want to buy a place here. Maybe I want to move abroad. You know, and I think being, you know, back in the day, you had your house, you had your security, you were going to work for this amount of years, then you were going to retire, and you were going to, you know, be secure in your old age. But now I think things are different because times have changed, so maybe that's why.
It's interesting that you put buying a house first. I'm going to come to you on this in a second, but I'll just go to the next slide, which should show wonderfully. So this is all in the little book, if that's too hard to read, but this is the average age of first-time buyers. I mean, it actually shows the spread of outright owners and, you know, recent first-time buyers and people with mortgages. But the crucial thing is the stat at the top, which says that the average age of first-time buyers has increased from 28 in 2007 to 34 today. And that is a massive jump for people who, you know, often see a home as their first level of security. And then the next slide is the average age at which a mortgage ends. And so you can see that that is getting much bigger. You know, 66 plus is increasing all the time. What are we going to do about that?
Solve it in 20 words.
So, yes.
I'm still reeling from being at the bottom of the USU end.
Yeah.
It'll be okay.
It curves up, though. That's the whole point, right? Yeah.
Showing off how young you are.
Such a low.
So no, it's an excellent question. I guess first to speak to some of the reasons that have caused this movement. So two things have happened in the kind of macro sense. One is the global financial crisis happened, which was pretty abominable, and a huge amount of new legislation came into play that made it much more difficult to get a mortgage for lots of very good reasons. You know, kind of historic repossession rates are at an all-time low, and consumer protection is at an all-time high. However, if you're 25 and trying to buy a house, it is pretty challenging. Average property price in London is now over £500,000, which means you're going to need like £100,000 in household income, maybe £100,000 in deposit if you want to access attractive rates. So it is a very difficult moment to be accessing the housing ladder, and consequently your wages need to catch up to allow that to happen. The secondary kind of unintended consequence of all this beneficial legislation is, and I won't bore you with the detail, but it used to be you could borrow 4.5 times your income. Now that's all gone, and instead there is a pretty detailed income and expenditure analysis done on your incomings and outgoings. And the best way to make a mortgage more affordable is to make it longer. So if you take a 40-year mortgage instead of a 30-year mortgage, your monthly repayments will be lower, and consequently you'll be able to borrow more. So consequently we've gone from an average 25-year mortgage term to now well over 30, and from most mortgages ending in the mid-60s, around, you know, the kind of notional retirement age, all the way into the early 70s. So again, I'm not sure that it's good or bad or right or wrong. I think it's just a function of the regulatory environment, and consumers still at their core very much wanting to own homes. The tricky bit is if you look at the numbers, so I think on average, and please correct me if I get this wrong, a homeowner will require somewhere in the region of £265,000 in pension pot in order to be able to meet the kind of normal life expectancy curve. But a renter will require £500,000 plus, because they won't have been building equity in their home all along the way. So that presents a real challenge where it's becoming more difficult to become a homeowner and challenging to save for your pension with kind of rising costs opposed to stagnating real wages. So I think and we've talked about this in previous thinkings, like the notion of the kind of retirement age where it is probably a redundant one, and we'll all be doing some form of kind of income generating work for much longer, and depending on how you feel about your job, you might be happy or sad about that.
I love it, so it's fine.
But secondarily, due to, you know, kind of historically low interest rates and the housing boom, like the next generation of homeowners is not going to be building up quite the same attractive equity nest egg. So I think even if you do make it onto the housing ladder, that house may not be appreciating at the same pace as the generation before. So that requirement will still be there. So I think the kind of cultural shift required, to allow for people to work into their 60s and 70s and 80s is very, very material, and I think very challenging. But also in this age of glorious and rampant consumerism, encouraging people to save in a meaningful way at an earlier stage in their life is very challenging, because I don't believe that first-time buyers want to buy a house for their retirement. I think they want to buy it because they want to own a home and have security. So lots to think about.
That 40-year... yeah, I'll come to you. So what's your name?
Max.
Hi, Max.
Sorry, you know, good.
Your point about building up equity, and maybe that's a cultural norm in this country, but less so on the continent. I don't necessarily have the answer, but my question I'm thinking is, but how are they coping in Germany and Spain and Italy, where, as I say, far less people own, or less caught up on the idea of ownership and equity, and maybe their rents are proportionately less, and maybe ours are particularly high. Maybe we're just talking about London at the end of the day. I mean, I'm just asking.
It's actually an interesting common misconception. So actually, home ownership rates, I think we're the 50th highest in the world. We are, although we are obsessed with our castle and land owning, actually in comparison to France particularly, we're slightly lower in home ownership. So the same problems remain.
Is that so? Because I mean, like you, I always thought that, you know...
No, everyone in Berlin's renting.
Is that because they've changed, or we've just got that wrong?
I think it's... there is a... I mean, the Brits have a pretty crazy narrative about home ownership, and we do like to talk about it nearly constantly, which is tremendous when you run a mortgage business. But actually, yeah, in real terms, statistically speaking, Europeans generally own and rent in reasonably similar proportions.
Okay.
Maybe there's I've just thought, I mean, that as the culture shifts towards less ownership of things, where, you know, people are now renting cars through car clubs and all that kind of thing, maybe the dial is going to move on that.
I was thinking exactly the same thing, obviously, with Corona and climate change. Obviously, getting on planes is a little bit less fashionable than it has been. And I did wonder if, you know, with kind of slightly more local and less kind of extravagant lifestyles, whether that allows for more saving, or whether we'll just consume more aggressively locally.
That's a good question. I'm going to go to this lady here, and then... could you say your name?
Anne Smackman. I was a property correspondent for about 10 years. On this ownership around the world, most first world countries had roughly the same level of ownership, which is around about 60-63%. Japan, North America, Britain. Countries of continental Europe in the north didn't, not unrelated to the fact they had lots of wars. And in southern Europe, you did have, and have always had, much higher levels of ownership, very fragmented because of the laws about passing on and hereditary stuff. So as we've moved further away from war, home ownership levels have risen. So Germany is the classic example. And people always used to cite, why aren't we more like the Germans? Well, they were the outliers and we were the norms. So that's just a bit of that. I think the main sort of thing that I feel though about this is, speaking as an oldie person, that actually the issue is not us thinking about ourselves and whether or not we will have a good age and whether we want to live longer and all that kind of stuff. It's the impact of what we do on the next generation coming through. And one of the things which has happened during my working life is that I think without an awful lot of forethought, the retirement age was abolished. And you can see absolutely what the advantages are of that. But in an awful lot of high status and well-paid jobs, one of the results of that was that nobody wanted to retire. And what's more, they thought that the longer they hung on, their business would have to pay them off to make them go. And the place which I was managing at the time, we could afford 2 young graduates for the price of 1 person at retirement age. And I think one of the things we have to think about is thinking about a natural arc of earnings. And how do we see the arc of earnings during our lives in a way that will be fairer? Because the other reason we saw home ownership fall is because of buy-to-let, which is my mastermind subject in those days. How boring of me. But you know, we saw people with equity buying property, and people saying, oh, well, more people are choosing to rent. No, they weren't. They couldn't buy because they couldn't compete against their parents' generation who were investing and had much higher equity.
What do you mean by the arc of earnings?
I think that we have laws that are still predicated, apart from the abolished retirement age, on the idea that if you just constantly go up or stay stable in what you earn, even though a very large number of people, in fact the majority of people now actually still retire at the age that used to be the normal retirement age. The average age for women to start working full-time is 60, and for men it's about 63, 65. But what we don't do is have a position where we make it possible for people to easily say and have a normal conversation that says, actually, I'd really like to work 2 or 3 days a week. And I appreciate I'm no longer the foreign editor, I'm now the such and such, but I'm still being paid that salary, don't want to work those hours. And it's not sort of, oh, well, you don't want to work here, then let's get rid of you. It's actually a conversation that is realistic about what people might want to do and what they can afford to do, and you can then build in some level of expectation. But we've sort of thrown out the pivotal point with the change in the retirement age, which, as I say, I love this kind of notion of liberty of it, but don't like what it's doing to the young, and I think we have to be a little more grown up and wise about how we handle that.
Yes.
I was just, well, I wanted to read you something funny back to the point about getting happier as you get older, which I love, which is a quote in the Times last year that said it found that women get progressively happier in retirement before overtaking men in their 9th decade. Psychiatrists say that this may be because so many of them are widowed by then. Which really made me laugh. Anyway.
Just as a footnote to that, in Japan they have something called the retired, women suffer from a depression called the retired husband syndrome, which you probably can imagine how that works, right? Yeah.
Anyway, back to the wider economic thought, I think there are a couple of things that when I think about this, I think we're going to have to see a major shift on. One is the expectation that wealth will be transferred. I think we're going to have the last big great wealth transfer coming up from the baby boomer wealth to sort of hopefully my generation. But after that, I think we need to prepare ourselves very much for the consumption of wealth within a generation. And I think just the very basic challenge of any sort of financial planning on this basis is you don't know what you're planning for in terms of longevity, and you don't know what you'll have at the end to plan with. You know, so we've lost the sort of traditional defined benefit annuity purchasing, straight line of pensions, and we're now in this very fluid world of having to sort of tack against changing circumstances. But what we all collectively, and I look at my teenagers, and they have very low expectations about home ownership. They have very low, thank God, expectations about inherited wealth. And they will be constantly sort of reframing their life and their financial life at various stages as they have 3, possibly 4 career iterations through their working lives. It's just a very difficult world for them to picture, because it's going to be so different to what sort of previous generations have grown up with. And then I mean, Anne, I don't know what you think, but I really struggle with the idea of the unfair weighting of what life looks like if you have access to capital or if you don't. I mean, it's now it's like dropping an anvil on society. If you have any access to capital, you're fine. If you don't have access to capital, you're not. And if you look at, what that means in terms of, should we be, for example, sort of a question, should we be saying a house is like any other asset and there's no reason why it should be exempt from capital gains tax? You know, what would that, I am asking myself a rhetorical question, it's not a question, but what would the world look like if what would that do to the market if you said it's just like any other capital gain? You know, why should it be exempt? Because I look at my house in London, I was lucky enough to buy it because I had a bit of capital. That's absolutely, I've done nothing but live in it. I haven't earned that growth, I haven't earned that capital increase. I just happen to be lucky enough to be in a position to buy the first one. That doesn't feel right.
And your point about the access to capital, I think, is important for the young generation as well. You know, in this booklet, you've got the fact that parental contributions to home ownership are up by £6,000. I haven't got the dates on that, but it was a big increase. That parents gave £5.7 billion towards home ownership, and making them the 10th largest mortgage lender in the UK, which is really extraordinary. And would you tell us what you did for your? This is not a home ownership thing, but it's back to pensions. What did you do for your daughter's 21st birthday?
Well, what I did was I set her up with a little pension, which was probably, the least glamorous present, or that caused a huge amount of consternation, but my husband and I did this for our children. A very modest one, I hasten to add, accepting that I know not everybody would be able to do that. But it was just really to have that conversation about the importance of saving for the future and how tax efficient it is, and listening to the young people in the room who were speaking a bit before and about kind of flexible lives and the choices that they want to have, and do they even want to be homeowners, because they might want to move around. The best possible thing you can do is be enrolled in that workplace pension, and it's not a coincidence that the highest take-up of auto-enrolment is 79% of young people in work, 22 to 29-year-olds. And it's just making sure that it's affordable, that it's a reasonable percentage that you can give up because your employer is going to match it, the taxpayers are going to help as well. And that will be locked away. And if you do put, it is 5% that you'll be contributing of your income each month, then by the time, whatever you choose to do in life, wherever you choose to go, that money is there for you in the future, in addition to, if you stay in the UK and you make your NI contributions, in addition to your state pension. And it is a really good way for you to save. And it seems to be that it's about the right level, because if you look at the dropout rates, because you don't have to be auto-enrolled, you can choose not to, you can be enrolled and then come out. But so far, it's early days, it started in 2012, people are staying in their auto-enrolment. So clearly people are finding ways to afford to do this, accepting that, especially in London, it's very expensive for young people to afford to live. But overall, the statistics do show that it's a good thing to do and it's a good choice for people to make.
I personally don't have that many regrets in my life, but the one regret I do have is not starting a pension earlier. Right? I've been freelance most of my life, and I set up a private pension somewhere in my early 30s. But if I'd done that at 21, if you just have to crunch the numbers and look at the multiplier effect, it's just a huge, even with just small, modest injections of cash, 3 or 20s, you can stop sometimes. So I'm in a similar boat with my own children. They've just come into a little bit of money, really little, but we're going to sit down next week and think about what to do with them, and having a pension is going to be top of that list, just to get the thing going, get it started. And also to embed the idea of thinking long-term, the arc, and starting that arc as soon as possible.
And also the point about capital, because that is a lump sum that somebody will be accumulating, and who knows what's going to happen in 40 years' time. But there is broad all-party support for pensions and the desirability of them, and the reforms that have been put through to enable people to be able to take lump sums of cash out. So people don't have to buy that annuity, that they can take some cash out, and maybe they can use that for a whole variety of reasons. But that capital lump sum is going to give them that choice and that stake that you were saying, of course we want everyone to have.
I'm going to go to Katie, our co-founder, and there was a hand here, and a hand here, and then a hand at the back, and there's hands all over. I love that. I'm going to come to you all. Katie.
I'm Katie. I'm the co-founder here at Tortoise, and this idea of pensions earlier is a really interesting. I had a meeting last week with with St James's Place, and I was having a business meeting with them, but. We were talking about, I said, I'm a customer of yours, and I put money into an ISA for my child every year because I'm worried for him and his future. And then the guy who runs investment at St James's Place said to me, well, that's great, but why aren't you making him a pension? I said, well, he's 9. Yeah. You know that you can set up a pension for a child when they're born.
Yeah.
And I said, no, and also, by the way, you are my financial advisor, so that failed me. But he then said, no, but what you can do if you pay, and it's a lot of money, but it's money that actually is less than an ISA every year for a child. If you pay £5 a day into a child's pension from 0 to 10, by 10 they will have capped out by the compound interest. I don't understand how money works, so let's just assume this man knows what he's talking about. But by the time my son retires, his pension will have capped out at the amount that is now the capped out amount, which is, I believe, £1 million in value at the point of retirement in the UK.
Someone's doing some sums here to check you.
So he said this to me in passing, and I thought, oh gosh, I've missed 9 years of this opportunity. But to your point about, what we can do for the next generation, I suddenly thought there's a couple of points there, which is one, I consider myself quite literate, but I'm very bad at financial literacy, right? So I didn't understand how, less than £20,000 in the first 10 years of my son's life would be I just don't get that because it's far too difficult for me to understand. But the fact that he made the point to me, and actually he worked it out on 50p a day and showed me what that would still be worth for people at retirement age, and it actually was a significant amount of money for people, whether you do 50p a day or £5 a day. But the point being that I don't think we know that, and I don't think that we are set up from our thinking. I've been putting into an ISA for my son because I thought that was the best thing to do. Actually, I should have put all that money into his pension. and I should have enabled him by the time he was. I'm very lucky that I can consider doing that, but it's a lot less money if I do it between 0 and 10 than if he starts paying in auto renew when he's 21 and hopefully has a job, and maybe he won't because they're with us forever apparently. That's what I've been told now. So I think there's 2 points to that, which is I think I don't even understand the financial literacy of that, and I think there is a bigger issue here about, yes, what do we do, how do we help future generations, but actually, when I lived in America briefly, the fact that I had to do a lot more of my own thinking about money with my 401k, which was horrific, and I'm not saying I would want to do that here, but you understand money more when you have to engage with it in different ways. And so I'd just like to say that everybody, if you can afford it and you are going to have children, do that, because I think it's the same as the gift to your daughter at 21, but I'm going to start doing it.
Done it better. Can I say, I think
amazing, right?
what was really, what you were saying there is there's something really profoundly important, and that's about making sure that we all access really good quality financial advice at all the stages of our lives, which most people don't. And yet there is really good free services. There's the money advice services, there's the pension advice service. There is really good independent, impartial advice for you. And it's readily available, calculators, but you and most everyone, we don't do it. And at key stages, whether it's getting a divorce or having a child or changing jobs or thinking about going away, really we should be checking in and just looking and seeing what's available. Then you can meet some advisors if you need to, if your life's a bit more complicated and you want to seek some advice. But so many times you see people at all ages, whether it's for young people or for you're looking after a parent, that suddenly, your mum's fallen over, broken her hips in hospital, can't come home. Oh my goodness, what do we do? I mean, so many decisions, big financial decisions are made in a crisis situation where some forethought, some planning, some thinking about it. I'm not saying everybody should go home every night and be going on to, the money advice service and worrying about it, but maybe once a month, or if we've got a bit of time, just to keep up to date with options and think about as our life changes. And as we're approaching making some choices and changes in our lives, sit down and think about our options financially like we would do in other aspects of our lives.
Thank you. The gentleman here?
Hi, I'm Rob. I'm, just a bit of my experience. I'm 29, desperate to get on the housing market. But in my experiences, getting on the housing market exists kind of around relationships. So your parents' relationships. I think in an age when marriages aren't lasting as long as they used to, I don't have the stats, but that's what I'm told, people are getting divorced and then that income's being split. So in my experience, the only people who are buying houses in London have got help from bank of mum and dad, never just from mum or just from dad. So people are splitting up, and then your parents can't, or your parent individually can't afford to give you, the 10, 15 grand deposit, or 40 grand, what it actually is. So, and also in an age where relationships, dating apps, if your relationship falls apart at whatever age, you're then scrambling around to find a friend who's also single to try and buy a house. And it's...
So you buy a house with a friend?
I am. Well, I plan to next year.
And are you, and is it more important to you to buy a house than sort of save for a pension?
Yeah, majorly. But I don't look at how much, I don't even know how much I pay. I'm auto-enrolled as well. I don't know how much because in my generation, the people who have money from, my parents' generation, have money just from the housing market. You never get, and you never say, oh, so-and-so down the road's loaded because they've got a great pension. So-and-so's loaded because they bought
a really nice house.
They bought in Hackney 20 years ago. So I think the concept of pensions, like you say, needs to be educated at a much earlier level because, as you touched upon, I don't think, well, I hope so, but I don't think any other generation again will experience as great things as my parents' generation.
And I'm going to go to some other in a second, but just if I go to the next slide, to touch on that thing you said before, Dan, about that these 40-year terms, that's from Santander's chief economist, which I hadn't heard of actually before I'd read it in the notes, because when I took out a mortgage, it was 4 times my salary, which you just said isn't available anymore. You know, for a 40-year term on a mortgage, how does that make you feel? Do you just accept that as a sort of norm?
Yeah.
So
Like,
that-
40 years doesn't
bother you
me
that?
because you think, oh, if I sit on it or I put a new kitchen in,
yeah,
I'll make, I don't know, 15 grand and then I'll sell it in a year or two. The actual mortgage, the barrier is getting on the ladder, getting the mortgage, the barrier is the deposit for most people in London, that's the truth. So the term, if I can pay cheaper, if I can do 40 years and pay less per month, that's much better for me. But what we say is around, more and more people renting. The rental prices are crazy. You can't afford to save. So we're kind of in a bit of a vicious circle. Okay.
I'm going to go to my colleague Alexi at the back, and then it's David, isn't it? Yes, and then the other hands I see around.
Hi, I'm Alexi. I wanted to make a plea for, I think, the rebranding. I think pensions need rebranding. Because at the moment, I don't know whether other people agree with this, but pensions seem to conjure up images of like gnarled hands and maybe sort of silver-haired people splashing around on holiday. And actually, what pensions are is free money. So I went for a drink the other day with a friend of mine who's also a journalist and who's had quite a similar career. And I only got involved in a pension when auto-enrolment came in, but he had been sat down at his paper at the age of about 24 by a senior manager and told, don't think of this as something that is relevant in 50 years' time. This is you have a choice. You can do the same job for the same hours and earn more money if you put money into a pension. So
don't call it a pension, call it free money.
Yeah. Free money.
It's a good idea. I think you're onto something. David, isn't it? Yes.
Yes, I have to confess I do shudder slightly. Much as I'm enjoying the Tortoise membership generally, I do shudder slightly every day when I check the app and see this strap line of 100-year life. Whose 100-year life? And in the booklet today, there's a stat saying that 1 in 3 live births today will live to 100. Now, but firstly, it's a slightly silly stat to quote because it depends on guessing what mortality rates are going to be 100 years out, and mortality rates, well, we're sort of reminded currently with the coronavirus pandemic threat, mortality rates a year out are quite uncertain. Mortality rates 100 years out are massively uncertain, and I was getting an idea. But that number as well is at least 2 ONS projections out of date. So if you look at how, if recently observed mortality rates were to persist forever, then the proportion of live births today reaching 100 would be about 2%. And if they were to improve in the way that, with a massive finger in the air, the Office for National Statistics assumes that they will improve, then it's going to be about 16%. So for even for the youngest people alive, of course it could be, it is so uncertain, there are scenarios in which very many of them will live to 100, but that's not a sensible assumption. That said, of course, whatever the numbers are, the premise of the thinking is absolutely right, that financing the length of retirement that people might have is a very major challenge. The thing where longevity is relevant there, the point that you made, that we're no longer sort of pooling longevity risk through defined benefit pensions through annuities, and so however long people will live on average will be a big dispersion around that, and if you don't know if you're the one who's going to die 5 years earlier or 5 years later, that makes a big difference to the pace at which you want to run down your capital in retirement. But the other thing that makes it very challenging, Dan mentioned low interest rates in connection with the property market. Low interest rates also make it incredibly challenging for young people to build up that pot they need by the time that they get to retirement age, because much more of that pot has got to come in the form of contributions and much less of it in the form of investment returns. And so you get whether it's for calculations that Katie's advisor at St James's Place is doing, which I haven't checked. Or,
Neither have I just hope they're right.
It was a DUP video put out recently talking about Einstein saying compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. Well, in a low interest rate environment, compound interest is rather less wondrous than it once was. That's a big challenge. Just briefly to pick up on Sarah's point about automatic enrolment, she said it's kind of seems to be about the right level because most people are staying in. Yeah, that's absolutely right. It has worked in terms of opt-out rates. The contributions at that level, if you go back to the Pensions Commission, were only ever supposed to achieve, they said the minimum that most people want is sort of 45% of median earnings. You get about 30% from the state pension, and here's sort of 15. If you save at this rate, you might get another 15% from private pensions. Since then, we've had state pension changes which cut the level of a state pension for younger people starting work today, and also probably return assumptions which you make are less optimistic than the ones that the Pensions Commission made. It all started a bit later. So I think it was only ever supposed to be less than most people would want, and you could question whether it's even going to deliver that without getting into a difficult trade-off of do we put up the rates and risk more people opting out.
Can I just say, Chris, quickly, without getting into too much of the weeds, I think it is a new innovation, and so I know that we'll keep it under constant review to make sure that the contribution rates will deliver an adequate income in retirement, and that is the combination of the state pension plus the pension pot. So there's already, there's a pensions bill in Parliament now, we're making further reforms. It's an area which will be under constant review because all those variables that you described, there won't be a government, it doesn't matter what political party they are, that will want to they'll want to make sure that citizens have enough income in retirement.
But it is quite a sort of slow review. So there was a review published in 2017 which said let's start contributing for the first pound rather than after the first sort of £6,000 or whatever it is now. And the government said, we'll do it for the mid-2020s, but told the Office of Budget Responsibility not to put that into any of their fiscal forecasts.
I think that's one of the ones they're looking at. Just so everybody knows, so we're all part of the same conversation, that you have to be age 22 and have an income over £10,000 to be auto-enrolled. And one of the commitments is to look at that, to bring it down to 21, even to look at people taking apprenticeships, and to look at incomes less than that. So that, I know, is a live discussion. Obviously I'm not a member of the government, but that's well talked about. I think the Pensions Minister, Guy Opperman, has said he'd like there to be greater contributions. I'm sure that will be livelily considered in Parliament.
I've got to go to this gentleman here because I've been promising him for ages, and then I'm going to go 1, 2, 3.
I wanted to share...
What's your name?
My name is Evgeny.
Evgeny?
Evgeny, yes.
Thank you.
I want to share a slightly different perspective on the idea of a mortgage. It's being discussed as a great financial instrument which may give financial stability 25, 30, 40 years later. But a different perspective is that it's a massive amount of debt. And if it works out well, if the market stays stable or if the investment goes up and to the right, everything is going to be okay. But as far as I can tell, we're living in an increasingly volatile, unpredictable world. Not to mention climate change, which is a big factor, but then there is rising inequality. We don't know how artificial intelligence is going to influence our lives. So many things are changing, and when I think about such a long time horizon of 25, 30, 40 years, frankly, I'm afraid to take $500,000 of debt under my own name to plan that I will somehow be able to repay it in 30 or 40 years, because if I don't, I will not be in a good place. I'm optimizing for flexibility here, and so unlike the gentleman on my left, I'm actively not planning to get a mortgage. Not that it would be easy, but let's say it's not
more like a millstone to you.
Yes, it's not as high on the list of priorities, so it's just a different perspective.
Okay, thanks, Evgeny. And the lady here, and then the gentleman.
I'm Jo. I'm a pensions correspondent, and I'm doing this tonight. I think I might be the free money correspondent. I write about pensions. I've been writing about them for 5 years, and I speak to all ages of people, and particularly the question is, how much is enough? And I say, if you're saving the automatic enrolment minimum, most certainly that is not going to be enough. To get the good pensions that were mentioned a moment ago, the defined benefit pensions that parents had or grandparents had that deliver a secure income for the rest of your life, employees and employers were saving 20 to 25% of salary combined. If you're saving the minimum automatic enrolment contribution, that's 8% at the moment. And that's not even your total salary. It is a band of your salary. So most people will be saving less than 5%. 5% of their salary will be going towards their pension. So I think the first thing to say is that people don't know that they're not saving enough and that they're sleepwalking into sort of a bad daydream. They'll be working a lot longer than they think they might have to or they want to because they're not saving enough. So I think the government has to take sort of steps very assertively to either address this issue of adequacy, because the coverage issue is there. We've got millions, tens of millions of more people saving, but they're not saving enough. They should be saving at least 12 to 15%. That's the recommended levels. If they want to have a decent, sort of comfortable level of retirement, so they're not sort of, heading towards a lot of disappointment. I know we haven't got much time left, so I'll just in my comments there.
Thank you. Did you say it was Joe?
Yeah.
Thanks, Joe.
Well, I'm natural consultant in the investment space and also in the political space. I wanted a bit to challenge the quote that we have there. The thing is that this probably works in the probably pre-crisis world. The thing is that you had one asset that is the house. You have another human capital asset that is your work, and then you have a notional debt that is the mortgage. The thing is that in yesteryear you had the housing price going up at a moderate rate. You had your long-term work, your salary, your wage would go up in a moderate rate. So things that you were like quite to the neck at the beginning, but then your salary went better. You could make repayments, etc. The thing is that now with inflation at ultra low levels, the thing is that you're not having those wage gains. In many cases, works are shorter. You have to settle for a job with a lower salary, or you end up in the gig economy making maybe less than the fixed than the minimum wage. And the thing is that also your asset, as we have seen in the last 10, 15 years, it's not something predictable. The thing is that, as you say, after 2008, many people ended up with negative equity in their house. So the thing is that it's really, is that affordability real, or is just basically that people have such low salaries that they are not going to afford a house unless you basically put them in debt for their lifetime?
I think here they mean a specific definition of affordability as in a bank will lend to you, because they can do that analysis, but I think your point is exactly right. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is the total interest cost of a 40-year mortgage is about twice that of a 25-year mortgage. So it is a big debt for a long time. It is not necessarily becoming more affordable over time.
Yes, you promised me.
I have promised.
Really, I should hand this over to Katie because she's the architect of this idea. But I'm actually going through a divorce, and so to your point, I'm scrapping with my ex about keeping the money for my children. But we should really be talking about new models of living. So we have talked long, many a night, about Bestie Row, which is all of us in our older age collaborating, buying a big house, and it will deal with social care, it will deal with mental health, it will deal with all of those factors, and we will live and we will look after each other and you can join in. But we have long talked about it, haven't we?
We have long talked about it, yeah.
And I wonder if there's been a discussion about that, because I think that's really where we should be going with this sort of older age. And
so the build on that is that for years you've had family as the model of social care and of community and of things, and as families change and as family dynamics change, why can't we build new models of living and new ideas
We'd
of
rather
family?
live with each other.
We'd rather live with each other than our husbands. She's divorced, I'm still married. It's really...
Don't tell him.
No, we've told him.
Remind me of your name.
Elizabeth.
So Elizabeth, there are models like that now. And there's a fund of money that the government put aside called community-led housing, which is for really innovative, new, different models. I mean, there's a great women's organisation who've been in the East End of London actually for years that pioneered this a long time ago. But you're absolutely right. You know, we're living longer lives, different sorts of lives, and the housing market and how we live and support each other.
So what was the model called?
It's called community housing. Community-led housing is a fund that you can apply to. There's a whole range of models of this. So if you look that up, you'll find something like Community Land Trust Organisation, and they will show you the different types of housing models that exist and how you might start to get engaged with that.
Because I saw there was one on the news this week in Holland, I think, where you had to be either 18 or 65 to live in this.
But we have them here too.
We
have them here too.
I'm just going to go to the gentleman at the front of the flag, and then the last word to Carl and Doug.
Two quick points. One is, I think, much discussion of affordability of housing is a very London-centric view of the world. There are plenty of affordable housing, 150 miles north of here, and with internet and the new ways of working, that's quite practical for many people to consider. Second point, briefly, I wanted to make is we talked about buy-to-let and the distortion it causes. There is a worse distortion, and that is the obscenity of buy-to-leave, which we see particularly in London and Docklands, where properties are locked up for 5 or 10 years in bulk, and there are people sleeping on the street, and it is a disgrace.
Carl, last word to you.
Gosh, so many things to try. When social care came up at the very beginning and it's only just sort of emerged now, we talked mainly about sort of pensions and housing. I think social care is the huge elephant in the room. It's starting to be on the radar here in Britain more and more. I think we're going to need to look at other models from other countries. Japan and Germany, you know, have pioneered new ways of funding social care in a much more collectivist way. So people have, in Japan, for instance, you've got a fund from the age of 40 everybody pays into, and then you know your social care is going to be covered, right? And I think not only does that give you financial security, but it also shows that we're all in it together, which I think is a very important part of aging well, to your point of living together in Bestie's row. And just, I know I'm conscious of the fact we're running out of time, so just as a final thought, try to sort of lift the room a little bit on the financial side, because I feel there's been a lot of downbeat. You know, I think there's a kind of drumbeat below everything we've been talking about tonight, which is that somehow we don't have enough money. There will never be enough money to pay for these longer lives, this silver tsunami, all these awful phrases that get thrown around to talk about these longer lives. Well, there is money, right? I mean, I just saw a stat the other day saying that between 2001 and today, the US government spent on wars in the Middle East $5.9 trillion, right? 5.9 trillion. There is money out there, right? There is money in the system. It's a question of finding the way to channel it and the political will to get it to the right places. And I think, you know, events like this are part of making that start to happen.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you. Thank you all to you. Those who've been here before know it's my job to do a very quick sort of wrap up of everything that you've said, which has been really interesting. So it's quite hard to do justice to. But I'm going to thank Carl for sort of bookending it with his positive notes that getting older is not a bad thing, it's a good thing, and that we will all be planking for 8 hours at 60, and I cannot wait. Then we need to get rid of the cult of youth and accept that there is a happiness curve, and I'm sorry you're at the bottom of it, but things will get better. Sarah, you said we you know, the biggest issue is that we don't want to engage with getting old. Auto-enrolment has sort of really helped with that, but we do need consensus around care, what the government's going to do about it, what the plan is for that, and that is the next step in our sort of longer life. We have to not make the mistake of Ellie's mum and actually do look ahead, unlike Liz, who thinks she's going to die in 8 years. It's been brilliant knowing you, Liz. Go out with a bang. I love Dan's thought about whether, you know, our consumerist culture is going to change, and maybe with kind of climate change and coronavirus it's going to dial down a bit more, and we will think about saving more, or whether we're just going to be really consumerist, really local. It'd be quite interesting to see what happens there. And I thought you made a great point about how we need to make this not a of generational war. I think that there's a big thing at the heart of this, that you can sense that undercurrent of the conversation is that they've got money and we haven't, and actually, you know, there needs to be a cycle of looking out for each other. And Doug, the same with you, how you brought in, you know, that there is affordable housing and there is, you know, that we can be very London-centric in our conversations about this. But Katie, it's really hard to think that we have to think about this from birth from our children, but maybe that is the next step. And I love Alexi's thought that we mustn't call them pensions, we must call them free money. That if we do that, everyone will think about them differently. David, I'm going to take on board your point that Tortoise needs to think more about whether we call it the 100-year life. Will we even get to 100, or will we all die of coronavirus? That is the question. But mostly I'm going to take away from this evening Bestie Row, that it seems a great idea, and everyone I saw nodding wanted to live there. So if we can all come and live on Bestie Row, I think that's the best thing to come out of tonight. Thank you so much for all your contributions. I found it really interesting, and thanks to our